Last week we just celebrated the centenarial anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which is, I consider, the foundational stone of the modern state of Israel. It is one step in the growing Zionist movement, but it is the foundational step, as I will explain in this short video. I'm going to talk about the significance of Balfour at 100, including some background history which many people are probably not aware of. I will be showing some maps, and we'll be talking about also what the enemies of the modern state of Israel and of the Jewish people say, and their critics, leftists, of the ramifications of Balfour. So what is the Balfour Declaration itself? Well, the Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917 by the British Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur James Balfour, who wrote a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, who was one of the foundational leaders of the Jewish community in Great Britain. The contents of this letter has become known as the Balfour Declaration. It is only 67 words in length, but it is extremely significant. Here's what it says, quote, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." So why did Britain issue this declaration? What was going on at the time? Well, World War I was raging, and it was probably about to be winding down, and the British and their allies were expecting to be victorious over the Ottoman Turks, whose empire was crumbling. Palestine was included in the empire. And if you see on this map that I'm going to show you here, this was a map actually of what's called the Sykes-Picot line in 1916. Even before the war ended, the Allies were starting to claim areas which they wanted to divide up in the Middle East to create various states for the indigenous people, and more importantly, from the point of view of the British and the French and the Italians and the Russians, to obtain territory so they could, in their own national interest, keep certain families in line who would protect their interests, such as the oil interests in the Middle East. The British were interested in Palestine and in that area. Now, the answer is, why did they issue the declaration, is subject to debate. I will give you four essential answers. One is that the British wanted to reward the Zionist leader most active in lobbying for a declaration, Chaim Weizmann, because of his invention of a process for producing acetone, which streamlined the manufacture of explosives to the Allied war effort in World War I. Weizmann was a statesman. He was extremely well regarded, well spoken, and had been a Zionist very early on. And in fact, he had befriended many of the British aristocracy, because he was considered pretty much Jewish aristocracy at that time. In fact, he laid the groundwork and met Balfour, as he recalls 40 years later. He met Balfour in January of 1906 and was very excited by this first encounter. And I have a slide over here which has a picture of Weizmann, and he states that he had a conversation with Balfour, who voiced the proposal that the Jews be offered Uganda as a homeland. The British were interested in creating any homeland, any place for the Jewish people, not necessarily in Palestine. And so Dr. Weizmann states, well, Mr. Balfour, suppose I was to offer you Paris instead of London. Would you take it? But Dr. Weizmann, we have London, said Balfour. True, but we had Jerusalem when London was a marsh. Are there many Jews who think like you, said Balfour. I speak the mind of millions of Jews, said Weizmann. And here's a picture of British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Secretary Lord Arthur James Balfour. A second explanation is that the British desperately needed the United States to enter the war, and some officials had an essentially anti-Semitic viewpoint that the American Jews had a great deal of influence in the government and would rally support for England. And they suggested that Weizmann potentially exploited this attitude. So for once, maybe anti-Semitic image of the Jews proved useful. They were believed to be so maliciously dangerous, as one commentator stated, that one would do best to acquire them as allies rather than enemies. That's a geopolitical reason. A third reason for British sympathy for Zionism is actually very much overlooked, but is a large part of the story. Religious Christians in Britain included its leaders, Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Lord Balfour themselves, who admired the Jews and believed the Holy Land was their spiritual home. Modern Zionism, they believed, would fulfill a divine promise and resettle the Jews in the land of their ancient fathers. They believed that Jewish Palestine was biblically ordained. What is interesting is that the Christian Zionist movement is completely overshadowed in today's world by the Jewish efforts rooted in the Bible, but expressed in a modern movement to build a Jewish state. In fact, however, since the 17th century, predating modern Zionism by more than 100 years, Christians advocated and imagined a Jewish return to the land of Israel. Until the late 19th century, most plans for a Jewish entity in Palestine were Christian. These plans were predicated on the perception that geographical Palestine was the ancient homeland that belonged to the Jews. This perception, rooted in a biblical worldview, influenced wide sectors of Christendom. And in fact, at the First Zionist Congress in 1897, sitting next to Herzl was indeed a Christian Zionist himself. So Balfour's religious belief influenced his political decisions, particularly on the question of a Jewish return to Palestine, which he felt would fulfill the biblical prophecy. A fourth reason that Britain may have embraced Zionism was to justify its entitlement to Palestine when it came time to divide the spoils of war. And as I just showed earlier, the map of Sykes-Picot from 1916, the British had designs on the area of Palestine. And they were hoping that they can gain support for that by trading off certain other lands to the French, the Russians, and the Italians. Now, Zev Jabotinsky, one of the foremost Zionist leaders at the time, declared that and credited Weizmann predominantly for his role in obtaining the Balfour Declaration. And his calculated and patient work established a link between us and each of the statesmen in Great Britain at the time. The endorsement of Zionism by most of the Rothschilds, also in London, is also due to his influence. So we will, in our history, the Declaration remains linked to the name of Weizmann. And as early as 1914, Weizmann had the foresight to conclude that the Allies would win the war and hope that Palestine would fall within England's sphere of influence, because the British were more likely than anyone to support Zionist and Jewish settlement there. But there is another diplomat whose name is generally forgotten by history, but whose accomplishments are significant. The name is Nahum Sokolov, and he was another Russian-born Jew who came to Great Britain. And during the spring of 1917, he secured the explicit and tacit assent of the French and Italian governments, and even the Catholic Pope, to a Jewish national home under British auspices. This is significant because the prior Pope, who Herzl tried to obtain support from, would not give support for a Jewish state. But Sokolov got the support of the Catholic Church and Pope Benedict, who told Sokolov the return of the Jews to Palestine was providential and God has willed it. So Sokolov's contributions are very significant as well. Without the support of the French and the Americans, it is unlikely that the opposition of British anti-Zionists to any expression of support for Jewish homeland could have been surmounted. But once the Balfour Declaration was announced, Sokolow and his colleagues succeeded in securing endorsements from France, Italy, Japan, China, Siam, and the United States. What's also fascinating and not well known is that the Arabs who were living in Palestine back at the time, actually, their leaders welcomed the Jewish presence. In fact, Emir Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein, the leader of the Arab revolt against the Turks, signed an interesting agreement with Chaim Weizmann and other Zionist leaders in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, supporting the implementation of Balfour. It acknowledged, quote, the racial kinship and ancient bonds existing between the Arabs and the Jewish people, unquote, and concluded that, quote, the surest means of working out the consummation of their national aspirations is through the closest possible collaboration in the development of the Arab states in Palestine. This agreement called for all necessary measures, quote, to encourage and stimulate immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale and quickly as possible to settle Jewish immigrants upon the land through closest settlement and intensive cultivation of the soil. Fascinating. You don't hear about that today. The international community accepted the Balfour Declaration. And in 1921, however, it was the beginning of I would say, the love-hate relationship that the Jewish people have had with Britain, because at that point, Britain then started to undermine the very essence of the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was incorporated into San Remo Conference in 1920 at the conclusion of World War I. And the British did all they could, it seemed, to cancel the mandate for Palestine, which they received and was approved by the League of Nations. And there's a map that I have over here which shows the mandate for Palestine, which you will see encompasses today's Israel and Jordan. And if you look at the map, you'll see very carefully, very closely, that Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Arabia, all their borders are defined as well. But the mandate for Palestine was a mandate that Great Britain received from the world and was recognized as such. Now, what's interesting also is that in 1921, Winston Churchill was the colonial secretary, and one of the first things he did was to sever off 78% of the land, the eastern portion, which became the country of Transjordan, and which the British envisioned to be an Arab country of 100% Arabs. And they put in the Hashemite kingdom, king over there in that part of the territory. So initially, at the very outset, this whole mandate area, which was designated to be the national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, the entire area, 78% is lopped off and given to an Arab state. So now we're talking about Western Palestine. The western quarter is then considered to be divided ultimately between Jews and another Arab state. That's what the British were envisioning, even though that is not what the mandate says. In 1922, the League of Nations put into effect what had been passed at San Remo and unanimously approved the British mandate for Palestine, rendering it an article in international law that has never been superseded even to this day. As my slide over here shows, the Balfour mandate, the Palestine mandate, enshrined the Balfour Declaration into international law, including the civil and religious, but not the political rights for non-Jews. According to Article 6, the administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions and shall encourage close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. That's a quote. So that is international law. Again, it called for close settlement by Jews of the land and acknowledged the civil and religious, but not the political rights for non-Jews in Palestine. In fact, however, you could argue that the political rights of the Arabs were indeed provided for by them being given an entire country, 78% of the original Palestine mandate, into the country of Transjordan. And as you can see from this next map over here, it shows the mandate for Palestine as of 1922, with Jewish Palestine considered the western portion, and that's about 25% of the landmass, and Transjordan is the country that that became Jordan later on. That's the Arab country. That country was designed not to allow any Jews to live there, and in fact, no Jews were permitted to live there. Yet, despite the fact that the Arabs received a state on 78% of the area that was designated to be the national home for the Jewish people in the British mandate for Palestine, the Arabs were not satisfied and in fact were hostile and continued to revolt. And major revolts against the Jews occurred under the watch of the British, especially in 1929 riots and in 1936. As a result, the British continued to limit Jewish rights in the area. And a commission called the Peel Commission was called to investigate. In July of 1937, as this map shows, they came up with a new partition for the western section of Palestine. And as you can see in the map, the Arabs received the lion's share of the territory. However, again, the Arabs rejected this map and this partition and continued to revolt. In 1939, the British government issued a white paper, which is a government policy of the British government. Essentially, this white paper canceled the Balfour Declaration and the mandate for Palestine under their obligations by the League of Nations. This was issued under the government of Neville Chamberlain in response to the Arab revolts of 1936 to 1939, and was essentially the new governing policy for mandatory Palestine until Britain actually departed in 1948, again in violation of their obligations as the mandatory power. In fact, this white paper rejected the Peel Commission's partition plan and stated that Palestine would be neither a Jewish state nor an Arab one, but an independent state to be established within 10 years. Again, a total repudiation of their obligations of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate for Palestine. Worse, the Jewish immigration to Palestine was limited to 75,000 for the first 5 years, subject to the country's, quote, economic absorptive capacity, and would later be contingent on Arab consent. What this essentially did is consign 6 million Jews to the death chambers in Europe because it did not permit and allow Jews to escape the Nazi Holocaust. This white paper also imposed stringent restrictions on land acquisitions by Jews, and the Jewish Agency for Palestine tried to issue a response to the British that they were denying the Jewish people their rights and considered this the darkest hour of Jewish history. But, of course, the Arabs rejected the white paper itself. Key provisions were ultimately never implemented of the white paper because of Churchill's opposition following a change of government and later the British preoccupation with World War II. Please see the next video, which deals with the significance and implications of Balfour.